you all for coming. I know it's a little cold out. We had to turn down the temperature so that Dan Balz would feel like it was in the middle of the New Hampshire primary when he came back today. A few things. We have a lot of great guests. We were joking with Dan that basically he can write the next book with the people in this room, I think so. But just a few folks that came out today. We have former Massachusetts Representative Gary Coons who came all the way out from Massachusetts. State Senator Don Soucy, Manchester. State Senator Lou D'Alessandro, who has perfect attendance. Former Congressman Mike Harrington, right here. Former Congressman Hodes. And a person who is very helpful to us getting speakers from time to time, Chairman Ray Buckley. Now your turn. I want to direct your attention to the sponsors here, and these breakfasts are wonderful, but the truth is we can't do them without our sponsors, so please, a round of applause for our sponsors. As you know, this is a great partnership with the New England Council, the New England Chamber of Commerce, and the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College. And I want to make sure all of you notice the new banner, which is definitely better than the previous banner. And there's one now in the milk room. And Kate Giaquinto is right here, put it all together, so we want a round of applause for Kate. So, without further ado, Jim, for purposes of introduction.
Neil stayed up all night for that introduction. When I introduce distinguished guests, Neil says, oh, there's a lot of distinguished guests here, and I'd like to introduce them. I just say, there's a lot of distinguished guests here. You know who you are. That takes care of that. And then Ray Buckley, the chair. I don't know why he's only helping us from time to time. Why did he help us all the time? But having said that, we thank him for all his help. First of all, I also want to thank all of you for being here today, and in particular, our relationship with St. A's, which is outstanding. It's a fabulous relationship. And it's due to Neil Levesque, who does an outstanding job. And we couldn't ask for that. And before I introduce our special guest, let me just tell you about a few other New England Council events that will be coming up in the next couple of weeks. As many of you know, we were pleased to honor Senator Kelly Ayotte as one of our 2013 New Englanders of the Year last month. But as you know, the vote to end the government shutdown prevented the senator from joining us at our annual dinner. So we're going to be holding a breakfast reception in her honor on November 22nd at the Institute of Politics. So we hope you will join us as we present the senator with her award. We also have several congressional roundtable events in the next couple of weeks, including a breakfast with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse on November 26th in Providence, a breakfast with Congressman Richie Neal on December 6th, and then a luncheon with the junior senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, on December 6th also. But today we're here to hear from someone who is truly one of the most respected names in journalism, the Washington Post, Dan Balz. Dan's career in the media has given him a front row seat to some of the biggest political stories and campaigns in recent history. You couldn't ask for a more qualified expert in presidential politics to speak to us today, as Dan has covered every single presidential election since 1876. Oh, 1876. And after stints with the Philadelphia Inquirer and the National Journal, Dan joined the staff of the esteemed Washington Post in 1978. And over the years, he's held a variety of positions in the newspaper, including national editor, political editor, White House correspondent, and Southwest correspondent. In July of 2011, the Washington Post named Dan as chief correspondent, making the first time the paper has ever granted that title to a member of its staff. Dan's work has earned him numerous other awards, one in particular, the American Political Science Association Award for political coverage. In addition to his work at the newspaper, he has also authored several books. His first book, Storming the Gates, Protest Politics and the Republican Revival, co-written with Ron Bernstein of the LA Times, looked at the historic 1994 midterm elections. In 2009, he teamed up with Pulitzer Prize winner Haynes Johnson, independent New York Times bestseller, The Battle for America, 2008, the story of an extraordinary election. His most recent book, Collision, 2012, Obama versus Romney and the Future of Elections in America, was published in August of this year and quickly earned a spot on the New York Times bestsellers list. The Wall Street Journal's Peggy Noonan described this book, Collision 2012, as, quote, the best presidential campaign chronicle in many years. It's a great book, in part because it isn't about what happened as much as about how people in the campaign were thinking. It's unusual in it that it gives proper place to the impact of thought on political outcomes. End of quote. I couldn't have said it better. We're thrilled that Dan was able to take time out of his very busy schedule to give us his insight in the 2016 race. Please join me in offering a very warm New Hampshire welcome to Dan Balz.
Jim, thank you. Good morning to everybody. It's nice to be on this side of the room. Normally I'm somewhere back behind one of the pillars listening to a presidential candidate, so it's a delight to be here. Neil, thank you also for helping to organize it. I think I may have said this the last time, but this is the most distinguished group of and brain power on politics in New Hampshire since Jim Brett dined alone. You know, you joke about the weather. It really does feel like it's primary day. I got up this morning in this brilliant and very cold morning, and I thought, you know, let's go talk to voters somewhere. Find out how this is going to go. A group of us had dinner last night, and we were talking about New Hampshire's role as the first in the nation. I think it's actually in danger this year for the first time in many years, because we already seem to have decided who the two nominees would be in 2016, with people talking about Hillary and Chris Christie. So those of you in New Hampshire who are defending the primary, you better make sure that we have a primary to go with. David Broder always taught me about the importance of New Hampshire when I was a younger reporter, and we would divide up assignments on the early states. There would always be a group of us who would say, well, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, but mostly Iowa, New Hampshire. David never hesitated. I mean, David's view was, you all go to Iowa, I will meet you in New Hampshire. I will go park in New Hampshire because I know that New Hampshire is the place that ultimately is going to decide the election. I want to talk a little bit about the book that I just published as a way to talk about where we are politically. And as Jim said, I wrote a book with Haynes Johnson, the late and great Haynes Johnson, about the 2008 campaign, and that was an extraordinary book, as our subtitle says, extraordinary election. Historic, obviously, first election of an African American president in this country, and a truly compelling story to tell. The rise of what we call the most unlikely presidential prospect in probably the whole history of the country. And when I set out to do this book, my concern, frankly, was that 2008 was so compelling that there was no way that 2012 could live up to that. It was obviously going to be a much messier story. The country was in a much different place. People were in a much more sour mood. The president had lost a lot of the luster that he had carried into the 2008 campaign. And frankly, I mean, I remember having a conversation with Don Graham our former owner of the Washington Post, and a great advocate for all the staff. And I said to him, well, I'm going to do another book about this campaign. And he kind of shook his head and he said, this was right as the Republican contest was kind of going in 4 different directions at once. And he said, well, I don't know who's going to want to read a book about that campaign. And so I took that as great encouragement. I'm part of the owner and continue to set out. But, as we went through 2012, the thing that struck me by the time I finished it was that, though it was not historic in the same way that 2008 was, that in so many ways it was a more important election than 2008. And I think it was more important because of what it told us about where we are as a country, who we are as a country, what the state of our politics is. In some ways, there was a kind of a false dawn about 2008. I think there was a hope when 2008 ended and Obama had won and the country had a good feeling despite the collapse of the economy. There was a sense that perhaps we could get past the politics that we had been through, the divisive politics of the Bush presidency and frankly of the Clinton presidency, and that President Obama, being of a new generation and not tied to a lot of the old, might be able to deliver the country to a different spot. And by 2012, we knew that was not going to be the case. And I think that the way the campaign was waged in 2012, the aftermath of 2012, and much of what we were able to learn about who we are in 2012 was a more important reminder of the kind of politics that we're going through. I called this book Collision 2012 for 3 reasons. The first was that it was a collision between 2 Americas. The America that elected Barack Obama in 2008 and the America that turned around in 2010 and put Republicans in power in the House of Representatives. These are 2 very different Americas, 2 Americas that barely intersect today in ways that America used to come together. The second reason I called it Collision 2012 was that it was a clash of philosophies. If you think about the gap between the 2 parties today compared to what it once was, it's far different. There was a time when there were liberals and moderates and conservatives in the Republican Party, and there were liberals and moderates and conservatives in the Democratic Party. And that is no longer the case. The most liberal Republican is probably more conservative today in the House of Representatives than the most conservative of Democrats. The views of issues have widened dramatically. The differences in view on the role of the government, the size and scope of the government, how do you create jobs, what's the best thing to do for the economy, and many of the social issues that long have divided the country politically, and in which attitudes are changing rapidly on some of them, created divisions in 2012 that were unlike some of the ones that we had seen in the past. And the third reason I called it Collision 2012 was that it was a clash of 2 extremely different personalities. If you think of where Barack Obama came from and how he got into politics, and where Mitt Romney came from and how he got into politics, you would hardly have 2 more different people. And as I toggled between Boston and Chicago and talked to the advisors from the 2 campaigns throughout 2011 and 2012, one thing became extremely clear, that Mitt Romney and Barack Obama had a genuine respect for one another as persons, for their families. They had, I think, almost nothing but disrespect for one another in terms of their worldview. I think the president felt that Mitt Romney did not understand the country as it was emerging, and I think Mitt Romney felt that Barack Obama did not understand the American economy in a way that would allow him to do anything constructive to fix it. And so you had these 2 personalities who were significantly different. The other aspect of 2012 that I think was very important to think about, because it continues to affect our politics, and that is the view on either side of the consequences if the other side were to gain real power, full power. political scientists who have studied the issue of polarization will tell you that one of the things that has happened over the last couple of decades is that one side's view of the other side has become significantly more negative over time. And as I would go around to rallies, whether they were Romney rallies or Obama rallies, and talk to people who were in the crowds, these were obviously partisans, and I often ask this question: what do you think is at stake in this election? What do you think are the consequences if your candidate doesn't win, if the other candidate wins? And at many of the Romney rallies, when I would talk to Republicans in the crowd, the response was, it was almost an apocalyptic sense, that if Barack Obama were to win a second term, that the values of the country, the values that people held very dear, that they believed had made America the greatest country in the world, would rapidly be eroded. And if I talked to Democrats at Obama rallies and said, what happens if the president loses second term and the Republicans continue to hold the House and maybe win the Senate? And it was almost equally apocalyptic. The view was, if that were to happen, the progress that this country has made over 30 years or 40 years or 50 years will be reversed. Now, when you have an election like that, you have the makings of a very big election. And in many ways, this 2012 election was an election about some very big things. Sadly, I think it was also fought in some often small ways. And as a result, we did not necessarily get a resolution to those issues. When you write a book about a presidential campaign, one of the challenges, obviously, is that every reader, anybody in this room, has followed the campaign closely. You know, the media covers this not just, day by day, but hour by hour, and now minute by minute in 140 character bursts on Twitter. So there are two ways to tell the story. One is to tell it from the inside out. The other is to tell it from the outside in. In telling it from the inside out, part of my goal was to tell people things that they didn't know about the campaign. And I want to highlight a couple of things that I think are instructive. One was, I sat down with Governor Romney long after the campaign, 3 months after the campaign. He was gracious enough to do an interview. Normally a losing presidential candidate doesn't like to do an interview with a reporter. So mostly say, why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why did you screw this up? Why couldn't you have done better? It was just the two of us, no aides present. We did it just outside of Boston at his home. And there were two things that struck me in that interview post-election. One was Romney acknowledging some of the doubts he had about his capacity to be the best Republican nominee that the party could put up. They had taken a vote at the end of 2010 as a family, 5 sons, $5 in-law, Mitt Romney and Ann Romney. Should he run again in 2012? The vote was 10-2. Only it was 10 no and 2 yes. And Mitt Romney was one of the 10 who said no. And I asked him about it. And he said, one of my concerns was that I wasn't the strongest Republican of all the people who might run to be the nominee, to take on President Obama. And I think as the Republican field finally assembled, he concluded he was the best. And he said if somebody like Jeb Bush had run, he might not have run. I'm not sure that that's true. I think he was always going to run, but he had some doubts. And but the field, as you know, the assembled was not exactly the strongest field that the Republican Party has put up in the presidential year. Rick Perry came and went pretty quickly. Had the best line about this. He later said, I ran against the weakest Republican field ever and they kicked my butt. So Romney was able to get over that concern, but he also had a concern about whether he was a right fit for the Republican Party as it had come out of 2010. And there was a morning in May of 2011 when the Wall Street Journal hit him with a very tough editorial about Massachusetts healthcare plan. And he woke up and he called his son Tag and he said, I'm not going to run. If I can't convince the most conservative editorial page in the country that I'm worthy of leading the party, I'm not going to run. that moment passed, but it was always a concern on his part. The other thing that was interesting about this interview with him was the degree to which he was still trying to process what had happened. He was complimentary about the president's get out the vote operation. He felt he had actually won the economic argument. There were some parts of the exit poll in which he could seize on to say that he had won the economic argument. But we talked about the 47% comment. And he was still in denial about what had happened in that episode. I said to him at one point, you said 47% of the country that will never take control of their own lives, will never take personal control of their lives. He said, I didn't say that. Got up and grabbed his iPad and went through his iPad and some things to me, some notes that he had made. Nothing which contradicted the fact that he had in fact said that in the surreptitiously videotaped fundraiser in May of 2012. And my sense was that here's a person who 3 months after the election still does not want to believe he said what he said, that whatever came out of his mouth, he did not want people to think it reflected his heart. And I thought the difficulty of presidential candidates going through a process like this, obviously a very brutal process, and coming to terms with, particularly with losing, and how difficult that is. There was another part of telling the story from the inside out, and that is, everywhere I went, any reporter went after the election, one of the first questions people wanted to know, and particularly Democrats, was what happened to President Obama in that first debate? Why had he performed so badly? A few days before the debate, Governor Romney got a call from George W. Bush, who said to him, Governor, or probably knowing him, he said Mitt, or maybe he had a nickname for him, who knows. He said, you're going to do just fine tomorrow night in the debate in Denver. And Romney took this as, somebody being kind and encouraging him. He said, thank you, Mr. President, I appreciate that. He said, no, you're going to be fine. I know from my own experience in 2004 that President Obama is not going to be prepared in the way he should be for the debate. The reality is presidents running for re-election often lose their first debate. And this was something that President Obama's advisors told him at the very first meeting they had of debate preparation in the summer of 2012. They put up a slide presentation, and one of the points they made was, presidents lose their first debate. The president said, well, let's see if we can, break the cycle of history. The truth was he couldn't. He had very, very bad preparation. Presidents think they know everything, particularly the issues that are likely to come up in a presidential debate. They are not well schooled in debating after 4 years of being surrounded by people who are very nice to them and respectful, as opposed to what an opponent on a debate stage is likely to be. And he was simply not prepared for the Mitt Romney who showed up on that stage. And he was conflicted about the strategy. His team had once told him, you have to be very aggressive, and then right before the debate they said, Romney's in a bad spot because of the 47%, pull back, stay above the fray. The president was skeptical about this, and I think he was never sure quite what his posture ought to be. I don't think that debate ultimately put him in as much jeopardy as some people thought, certainly at the time. But there was obviously great concern about what had happened. And it took the president a number of days to kind of come to terms with how badly he had done and what the stakes were for the subsequent debates. The debate, as you remember, after the presidential debate was the vice presidential debate. And Vice President Biden arrived in Kentucky for that debate on the afternoon before the debate. And he took a phone call as he arrived and finished the phone call, walked over to an aide, and he said, well, I now know we are in real trouble. And the aide said, what do you mean? He said, well, I just got off the phone with the President of the United States. And the President said to me, Joe, tonight, just be yourself. He said, in 4 years, he's never said that to me. And he was himself that night, as you all remember. And one of the lessons out of the debates that the Obama people took away, and it goes back to one of my points at the beginning, we are in an era when events like those debates are no longer forums for trying to persuade undecided voters. That they are events in which the most important thing you can do is to energize your own base. And the way you do that is by going after your opponent as hard as you can. If you remember, the second presidential debate was the town hall forum that began in 1992. And there has always been a sort of an acceptance of the idea that is the one debate where you have to be careful about going after your opponent, because you have voters on the stage who are asking you questions, and you just have to be a little bit more restrained. And that was always the belief about that debate. And what the Obama people concluded, and I think the Romney team as well, was that those rules were out the window in the politics, in the age of politics that we were in 2012 and have been in. That the most important thing you can do is to go after your opponent and to knock your opponent down, as opposed to thinking that there are X number of undecided voters who you have to reach. So that was another of the lessons. Telling the story from the inside out, though, is, I think, only part of what we as journalists and authors of a second rough draft of history are obliged to do. And I say that because one of the things Dave Broder always taught me, and Haynes Johnson always taught me, is that campaigns are about more than the candidates. The campaigns are about voters, the campaigns are about the country. Campaigns are about big ideas, campaigns are about big forces. And for all the wisdom that resides inside campaigns, and for all of the tough decisions that campaign operatives have to make, and for all of the research that goes into how do we phrase this advertisement, and all of the testing that goes in, and all of the maneuvering that goes on, very often campaign teams are working at the margins. There are certain realities of any campaign year, and it changes from year to year, that are as likely to affect the outcome as all of the expertise in a campaign. And I think that in 2012, and as we continue forward, several of these were as or more important as all of what the campaigns did in their head-to-head maneuvering. The first, obviously, was the economy. I mean, we know that all presidential campaigns, the cliche, they're about peace and prosperity. And in 2012, the question was the economy just good enough to allow President Obama to win re-election, or was it just bad enough to make it almost impossible for him to win re-election? Toward the end of the campaign, I know there were a lot of Democrats who were going to Nate Silver's blog about 4 times a day to reassure themselves that the president was going to win re-election, because a lot of the national polls were tight, and it was unclear exactly from some of those polls how it was going to go. A year before so he was to them, as David Axelrod, the sainted Nate Silver. A year before the election, he wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine with the headline, "Is Obama Toast?" Headline was a little more provocative than the piece, but the point of it was exactly what Obama's team had always said. Our toughest opponent is not necessarily going to be Mitt Romney or the Republican nominee. Our toughest opponent is the economy. And they had only limited ability to affect the economy, pro or con. The economy is obviously affected by much bigger forces. He was not going to be able to get another stimulus package through Congress. He was tied to whatever was going to happen in the economy. Now, toward the early fall of 2012, economic mood brightened. There's a debate about why that happened, but there's no question that after the 2 conventions, attitudes about the economy and about the direction of the country began to brighten. They were still negative, but they improved. They were somewhat more optimistic than they had been. That may have been a crucial moment in the campaign that was in some ways overlooked. And in talking to Governor Romney and some of his team afterwards, their view was, when you asked them, what do you think the main reason the election ended up the way it did? Their view was, the economy got better enough that it made it very difficult for us to get over that hump. The second big force that, again, I think came into view just after the election, particularly for the Romney team and many in the Republican Party, are the changing demographics in this country. There's a quote in the frontispiece from Adlai Stevenson back in the 50s that says something to the extent that there is a new America every morning when we wake up, whether we like it or not, or whether, we are in an era when there is a new America that has been and continues to emerge. Obviously an America that is much more diverse than the America that I grew up with, that many in the room probably grew up with. An America in which not only is it more diverse America, in which attitudes about many issues are changing. And I think that if you look at one set of numbers, you can see the challenge that I think that the Romney campaign underestimated in 2012. And that is the share of the electorate that's white or non-white. And over 40 years, this has been going down. The share of the electorate that's made up of white voters continues to tick down. It's still the overwhelming share. But when Reagan was elected in 1980, the share of the electorate on election day was about 88 or 89% white. When George W. Bush was elected, it was 80% white. And when Barack Obama was first elected, it was down to 74% white. I think Romney's team believed that because of what had happened in 2010, that might have leveled off in 2012, that maybe it would stay at 74% white. These numbers don't sound like they're a lot, but in fact they are enormously significant, each percentage point. Given now the makeup of the two parties and where they get their votes is highly significant. Mitt Romney got 9 of every 10 votes from a white voter. Barack Obama got 4 of every 10, or slightly more than 4, from a non-white voter. Barack Obama lost the white vote by a bigger margin than any Democrat who's ever won the presidency and still won the White House because he won 80% of the non-white vote. This is a reality that was at the heart of the Obama campaign strategy all along, and particularly the role of the Hispanic, the fastest growing population group in the country, and one that the Republicans have struggled over as long as I've covered politics to figure out a consistent way to appeal to them. Obviously some Republicans, George W. Bush being one as president, Jeb Bush and George W. Bush as governors, have done well. Chris Christie got 51% of the Hispanic vote in his re-election last week. But nonetheless, Republican presidential candidates have not done well with this. Mitt Romney got 27% of the vote. John McCain got 31%. Political party in this day and age cannot afford to have that. And I think that this was something that the Obama team knew, believed would be the case. They believed that the electorate would be 72% white, which is what it turned out to be, and that the Republican Party struggled with in 2012 and could continue to struggle with going forward. The other big force, and I want to end on this, is the red-blue divide in this country. I alluded to this at the beginning, but I think this is in many ways the most significant factor in our politics today. Obama gave that famous speech at the convention in Boston in 2004 with the line that brought the audience to its feet. We're not red America or blue America, we're the United States of America. And yet, if you look at what has continued to happen, in some ways you could argue that red has gotten redder and blue has gotten bluer. There were only, this election was decided by roughly 4 points in 2012. There were only 4 states that were decided by 5 or fewer points in 2012. Most of the rest, many of the rest were blowouts. Red blowout, blue blowout. In 1960, in that very close race between Kennedy and Nixon, there were 20 states that were decided by 5 or fewer points. We have grown apart as a country. You can look at this in a variety of ways, You could look at the polarization in Congress, you can look at the polarization of attitudes, but in many ways this red-blue divide is the most significant factor in the way our politics is practiced, and I think in the way that we now have gridlock in Washington. There is, as we look ahead, you could draw almost a straight line from what happened in 2012 in the election to the government shutdown. We used to think, as I said, we used to think that elections decided some of our differences, that we would have a big debate in an election year, particularly a presidential election. The country would come down on one side or the other, and the elected representatives would take that message and begin to try to work together to try to do some things, but that the winners would have some ability to try to put their policies in place. I think what we saw after 2012 was an unwillingness on the part of either side to yield much to the other. And I think that this is much more now, has been a more important and frankly worrisome part of our politics than we've had in the past. I don't know whether we are now at another sort of inflection point. The trauma of the shutdown and the damage that did to the Republican Party is significant and potentially important depending on how things play out over the next several years, frankly. At the same time, the president's weakness, I mean, he is now at a historic low in most public opinion polls, presumably because of the damage that's been done by the rollout of the Affordable Care Act. He is in a very difficult place. So you have two parties at weak points in a very divided country, and with a Republican Party that has to go through a very big debate. As we look ahead to 2016, and it's frankly a little odd this year that we're almost past the 2014 elections and people are trying to get to 2016 faster than they should, but nonetheless I think it's a reality where we are today. The Republican Party has a very big debate that it's going to go through, and we began to see the outlines of that in the last couple of weeks because of the Virginia gubernatorial race, the Christie's victory in New Jersey, the Alabama special election that took place, the establishment versus the sort of insurgent side of the Republican parties, who are, if not at real war, are certainly at loggerheads about what's the right path for the Republican Party. That's a very big and a very important debate, because at this point there is no obvious way out of this kind of gridlock that we're in, or this set of divisions that we're in. It's either going to take a remarkable leader to do it, but given the kind of structure that the politics that we have, I'm not sure that even a strong leader can easily overcome it. It may happen because of all of you. I mean, that ultimately voters are going to come to some conclusion that that Washington truly is broken, and that the only way that it's solved is to, in a decisive way, push in one direction or the other and give power to one side or the other. At this point, it's hard to see how that happens because we are relatively closely divided and deeply divided. So we have had, as I say, a very important election in 2012, an election that told us who we are and where we are. And we can see that we have continued on that path since then, and maybe heading toward a replay of that in 2016. I wish I could be more optimistic. I'm an optimist by nature. I'm a Midwesterner, so we're all optimistic. But when I thought about this, I am more pessimistic about the state of politics today than I have been in some time. And I think that that's the challenge, not just for the people who are running, but for the people who are running campaigns and for all of the voters as they think about the consequences of where we are. I mean, we have problems that need to be solved. And until we can get a functioning government in Washington to do it, we're going to kind of continue to stumble along. So as important as 2012 was an election, I think that 2016 may be as or more important in giving us a sense of whether there is some way to begin to break out of that. And on that cheerful note, I thank you for having me.
I We have a few minutes left for a question or two. Maybe I just ask the first question. You talk about the super PACs and the role that they played in the 2012 election. I thought they played more of an impact in the primary than in the general. People like Santorum and Gingrich, they wouldn't have lasted as long as they did without the super PACs helping them. But what impact did they have in the general election?
I agree with Jim. I think that they did play a role in the primaries. The two you cited obviously helped those two candidates carry on when, by all conventional measures, they should have been out of the race. Romney's super PAC obviously helped him a lot too. I mean, the amount of money that super PAC spent tearing down Gingrich before Iowa was significant, and going after Gingrich after South Carolina. So they did play a role in the primaries. In the general election, I think that the money just all finally cancels itself out. There were $6 billion spent in this campaign overall, roughly $1 billion by each of the two main candidates. And then if you add in super PAC money and House and Senate money, $6 billion, and we had a status quo election. President re-elected, the House of Representatives still in Republican hands, and the Senate still in Democratic hands. And I think that there's a law of diminishing returns on the amount of money spent on advertising, for example. I don't think that after a point people pay that much attention. And I think partly because so many people already know how they're going to vote in the end. And the single most important thing you can ask somebody is, do you consider yourself a Republican or a Democrat? And if you're an independent, do you lean Republican or do you lean Democratic? That is going to tell you 9 times out of 10 how that person is going to vote. I mean, people now vote their party. There's very little straight ticket voting, so all of this money that gets poured in, perhaps in a very, very close race it makes a difference, but I think in the great scheme of things, that doesn't. Having said that, I think super PACs continue to play an important role in the shaping of the way campaigns are run, and in a sense reinforcing the negativity of political campaigns as opposed to something that's a little bit more positive. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dan. My question is, you mentioned a moment ago in your talk, Kennedy Nixon race, 50 some years ago, 60 years ago. And after that, my question to you is, I'm thinking about how today President Kennedy would probably not recognize his own party, but Nixon would probably be very comfortable in today's Republican Party. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on whether or not there's been a seismic shift in the Democrats to the left more so than the Republicans to the right.
To be honest, I'm not sure I would agree with that. I mean, if you look at Nixon as president, you could argue that he had one of the most liberal domestic policies of any president since then, including President Obama. I mean, I think some of the things that President Nixon was talking about or thinking about in terms of national health care were more liberal than the Affordable Care Act ended up. And certainly a president who instituted wage and price controls would not be considered conservative by today's standards, and there are a lot of conservatives who are upset with that. I think the Democratic Party, in two ways. I mean, the Democratic Party has gone through, since Kennedy, obviously, a series of changes. And the 70s and 80s, the party was moving to the left, had moved to the left, and allowed Reagan to pull in Reagan Democrats. Vietnam had a very big effect on the psyche of the Democratic Party, and it took many, many years for that to work its way out, and I'm not sure it's entirely worked its way out. If you think of Bill Clinton in 1992, it was Bill Clinton who began to reorient the Democratic Party in a more centrist direction. I think that since he left, the party has moved somewhat to the left. I don't think the party is divided on many issues, but I think that mean, when we talk about a Hillary Clinton run, I mean, the assumption is that there is potential for a challenger to her on the left because there is a part of the base of the Democratic Party that is much more liberal on some of the international issues, use of drones, for example, surveillance, another, and on the question of income inequality. I mean, New York City is not America. I don't mean to suggest that, but the election of Bill de Blasio last week in New York is notable for the way he ran the campaign and for the size of the margin he got. I mean, it was a hugely successful campaign. He ran on the tail of two cities and income inequality. The Republican Party, by every measure that we see in polling, is more conservative today than it was 15 years ago. If you look at issues like environment or size and scope of government, the Republican Party has moved to the right more than the Democratic Party has moved to the left on some of these same issues. So I think that at this point, I mean, I don't know how comfortable Nixon would be in today's Republican Party, but this is not original to me. There are a number of Republicans who have said Ronald Reagan would struggle to be nominated in today's Republican Party, given some of the positions that he took as a governor of California, including raising taxes and signing an abortion bill. So I think that the shifts, we'll see how much the Democratic Party is divided as we go toward 2016. There's obviously disappointment with President Obama, particularly on the left, but I can't recall a case in which we've seen such rallying so early behind one candidate as there has been the rallying behind the idea of Hillary Clinton running for president as the Democratic nominee. So, the last point on this, political parties are organic. They're not, they're dynamic. They're not static. Events change them, and victories and losses affect them. And I think that particularly the Republican Party, after losing twice in the presidential race, is obviously going through some soul searching, and there is a real division within the party about what's the right solution.
Tony?
Yeah, historically speaking, is gerrymandering worse now than it's been in recent memory? And what do you think the effect of it is on the House of Representatives and how it's operating and not operating over the last few years?
Gerrymandering per se is less a factor in the divisions and the polarization in Congress than I think is popularly understood. The makeup of congressional districts is a significant factor. There are many more safe seats on both sides than there used to be. There are many more landslide seats than there used to be. There are fewer swing districts in the House of Representatives today. That's less gerrymandering per se. I mean, you can do gerrymandering state by state at the margins, but people who are more expert about line drawing and the consequences of it than I am have concluded that it's not so much gerrymandering. It's a variety of other factors that affect our politics. I mean, for example, I was talking to somebody the other day who said, if you look at some districts that have moved from Democrat to Republican or Republican to Democrat, 30 years ago, you would expect the person who represents that district to be a more moderate politician in their voting behavior. And now, today, what happens is, you have a Democrat in a seat who votes very liberally, along with the rest of the party, and loses that seat to a Republican, and the Republican comes in and is, much farther to the right than historically would have been the case. Part of it is behavior. Part of it is the reinforcement that they are getting from their constituents. And part of it is, to go back to this question of the district lines, part of it is where people now live. I mean, Democrats are packed into urban areas in a significant way. There's a statistic that I came across when I was working on the book. Obama won roughly 700 of 3,100 counties in this country. But of the 39 counties with populations of 1 million or more, he won 35 of them. And he won those counties by 8 million votes, and he lost the rest of the country by 3 million votes. So the imbalance of our population also contributes to the shape of the districts and the constituencies within the district. So it's a whole series of factors, if we had pure redistricting and a pure redistricting process, totally free of politics, you drew the contiguous boundaries, you didn't have these, terrible lines the way some are drawn. It might change things at the margin in terms of the balance of power in the Congress. It might narrow the Republican advantage. There's a built-in Republican advantage right now. But it wouldn't necessarily change the nature of the way people are voting, because I think that's a deeper problem than simply the shape of the districts.
Yeah.
I just want to ask a question. Do you think the Iowa caucuses will be as influential in 2016 as they've been in the past? Because they really screwed up in 2012. Okay, and they couldn't even pick the right winner.
That's true. It only took them a month to figure out who won. I have, in terms of the Republicans, I think that, one of the risks for Iowa is it diminishes itself as a true test in the Republican primary in a presidential caucus. That caucus has become much more dominated by the most conservative wing of the party. Although not entirely. I think Iowa's problem is they have a straw poll in the summer before the election year. And then they have the caucuses. And I think it was Dave Broder who first made the argument that no state should get two first bites at the apple. And what we've seen, first of all, is the diminishment of the straw poll as any kind of a reliable indicator. It is a huge drain on the resources of candidates, and it ultimately tells you nothing about who's going to be viable in the caucuses. But I think that what we may be moving toward is a situation in which Iowa selects somebody on the right side of the political spectrum as a prominent candidate, and New Hampshire picks somebody who's a little less so. South Carolina will be South Carolina, and you're going to get a split decision early on in those first three states. And what that will mean is that instead of somebody being able to run the table and therefore, carry forward very quickly and close it out, you have the potential for the kind of elongated fight that we saw in 2012. So, but people in Iowa, put aside the problems they had counting votes that night, people in Iowa, I think, are concerned about whether the credibility of their caucus has been or is being diminished, and what to do about that. But I don't know that there's any simple solution to that.
Maybe one more question?
Dan, you were just getting at this in the question just before. When you talk about the red-blue state divide and how that factors into voting patterns, be curious to know your thoughts on how what seem to be traditionally red states like Virginia, Florida, and even up here in New Hampshire, have gone blue for the president in the last two elections. A lot of that might be driven by the city, the urban populations voting just enough to push it blue. But I think it's a fascinating trend over the last two elections, and curious to know your thoughts.
It's a good question and a very important one, and I think one that is certainly worrisome to a lot of Republicans as they look at the map. If you look at the electoral map, back in the 80s when Reagan was ascendant and preeminent, we used to talk about a Republican lock on the Electoral College. And that's clearly gone. I wouldn't say the Democrats have a lock on the Electoral College, but at a minimum, there are now 18 states in the District of Columbia that have consistently voted Democratic over the last 5 or 6 elections. They add up now to 242 electoral votes. If you simply add on Florida, you're the president if you're the Democratic nominee. And then you look at some of these states that we think of having long been red states, which are moving. Florida is obviously becoming, a tougher state for Republicans. It's still red in many ways, but in a presidential year, because of the growth of the non-Cuban Hispanic population, it has become a gettable state for a Democratic president. And if those trends continue, it will be more and more difficult for Republicans to win. Now that was a state that was decided by basically 1 percentage point. That could have gone either way. You could argue that the Obama get out the vote operation was decisive in Florida, but nonetheless it was made possible by their ability to find and register a lot of voters, minority voters, who had not participated in the past. So if you look at a state like Virginia, that too is a state that's changing demographically. More Hispanics there, as you suggest, the population just outside of Washington D.C. in those Northern Virginia suburbs, A, have been fast growing, and B, have been more and more Democratic with each election. And so, Virginia had not voted for a Democrat for president since 1964 until Obama won it in 2008, and he won it again. One would have expected that the Republican nominee for governor in 2013 would have won. They'd gone through 9 elections in a row. The candidate for governor who represented the party that held the White House lost the race for governor in Virginia. That was broken this time. You had 2 candidates, neither of whom was a particularly attractive candidate, Ken Cuccinelli, the Republican Attorney General, and Terry McAuliffe, the Democratic nominee, who was party chair and longtime fundraiser. Neither one was particularly attractive. All things being equal, you would have expected that Cuccinelli could pull it out. Why he lost? Very, very conservative, probably too conservative for the state. The government shutdown affected Northern Virginia in ways it didn't affect other parts of the country. But I think out of that you have to conclude that Virginia in a presidential year is now a swing state. It's not a blue state yet, but it's clearly a swing state in the way it hadn't been. And you can see similar things that have happened in New Hampshire. So the number of true battleground states in 2012 was the smallest we've ever seen. It really was 6 or 7 or 8 states that were truly competitive. And you could have the same kind of thing in 2012. So Republicans are going to have to try to figure out a way to put into play some states that they haven't been able to do that. It's not just being able to win Florida again or Virginia again. They've got to figure out a way to put some of what I would say the sort of the heartland states back into play. Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. Illinois, my home state, seems out of reach for Republicans for the foreseeable future. But Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin have consistently gone Democratic, even though they ought to be battleground states. And so Republicans need to find ways to be able to win those constituencies.
Okay, well, we want to thank Dan for Dan for being so gracious with his time and coming to the politics nights here in New Hampshire. His book, Collision 2012, is in the rear. Make a great Christmas gift. And I have 20 books here that I can design for some of my friends. So it's a great book. And we look forward to having Dan back in some familiar settings in the back of the room with the other candidates will come. But what makes Dan unique as one of the most influential and most respected journalists is that he listens. He listens to what people have to say, and he really is able to absorb an awful lot of what he hears from each and every person that he encounters. And it's refreshing to meet someone like that who just says, I don't have the answers, I'm here to listen to what people have on their mind. And you see it in his writings. We're so blessed to have him here, and he truly is. I always thought David Broder was the finest political journalist that we've ever seen, and he truly is following the footsteps. And I believe that David's looking down and saying, if there's anyone associated with my name, Dan Balz. So we're pleased to have him here. Look forward to having him back, and look forward to having all of you back. Thank you.